We are going to rescue 70 American prisoners of war, maybe more, from a camp called Son Tay. The target is 23 miles west of Hanoi. This is something our American prisoners of war have a right to expect from their fellow soldiers. Our mission is to rescue prisoners, not to take prisoners.
He was down on stage, had a big map of North Vietnam, had a big red circle around Hanoi and another one around Son Tay. And when he finished his little talk there, I mean, it was just dead silence, like for, maybe 5 seconds at the most. And then it was just like everybody jumped up and was yelling, hollering and whistling and saying, let's go get them. That's what we're here for. And Bull kind of calmed everybody back down and said, this is a strictly volunteer mission. We have a 50-50 chance of not making it back. And he said, if anybody wants to back out now's the time to do it. Nobody did.
Welcome to Combat Story. I'm Ryan Fugit, and I served Warzone tours as an Army attack helicopter pilot and CIA officer over a 15-year career. I'm fascinated by the experiences of the elite in combat. On this show, I interview some of the best to understand what combat felt like on their front lines. This is Combat Story. Today, we hear the combat story of Terry Buckler, the youngest of 56 Green Berets on one of the most dangerous and daring missions in U.S. military history, when they went 300 miles behind enemy lines into North Vietnam to rescue American POWs at the Son Tay POW Camp. Terry is part of a rare group known today as the Son Tay Raiders. The mission does not have the intended outcome, as you'll hear in this interview, but changes the lives and morale for hundreds of American POWs for years to come. I sincerely hope you enjoy this front row seat to one of the most impressive, selfless, and expertly planned and executed operations in our military's storied history. Enjoy. Terry and Cliff, thanks for taking the time to share this interesting story with us today.
Hey, we're glad to be here.
And
pleasure.
Yeah, and Terry, just for the benefit of those listening, this is, as many of the people who listen will notice, this is the first time I've interviewed two people at the same time. So I want to make sure that we establish who's who here as we talk about the Son Tay Raid and this fantastic book, Who Will Go, and we'll read excerpts from that. But if I could, Terry, just if you could introduce yourself briefly. We'll get into your childhood, what you experienced in combat, and then Cliff, I would ask the same before we get into the meat and potatoes of this. So Terry, over to you if you could just share your role in what we're about to talk about here with the Son Tay Raid.
All right. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here and look forward to this. A little bit about myself. I grew up on a farm, born on a farm, and lived there till I was 18 years old, graduated from high school, and my dad felt like once you graduate, you're on your own. And that's kind of the way it was in our family. And so I moved out and went to work for a company building in a factory and got drafted in, actually I volunteered for the draft in March of 1969 after being inducted into the U.S. Army. I went to Fort Leonard Wood for my basic. After basic, at that time, I volunteered for Special Forces and finished basic in my AIT at Fort Leonard Wood. I was a 12 Bravo engineer, and from there went to jump school. And from jump school, Special Forces training. Once finished training, I was assigned to 7th Group at Fort Bragg. And from there is where the history starts.
Yeah. And so, and I'll have you pause there and we'll jump to Cliff here. And just to say, Terry and Cliff wrote this fantastic book. Terry, you are a participant in the mission that we're going to talk about. So that's why I just wanted to set the scene for that. Cliff, you, I know as we discussed earlier, probably feel like you participated in this event from all the research and work that you've done there. And you do have a very close connection to it beyond that. So I'll just pause to let you share that briefly, Cliff, and then we'll dive in.
As a matter of fact, during the Son Tay Raid, I was 4 years old. So my father is the one who participated in it. He was the aircraft commander of Lime 2, one of the C-130s that escorted the helicopters to the North Vietnam airspace. For me, I grew up obviously as an Air Force brat. I ended up going to the Air Force Academy and graduated in '88, flew B-1 bombers. And all through the years, I've heard stories from my dad about the Son Tay Raid. With the 50th anniversary coming up, which was just this past November, Terry and I started working for quite a few months to try to get a book published that Terry had had a vision for since 2012. And it was a real just honor to be able to interview these gentlemen, Terry's story, but also 40 other participants, including POWs, Air Force, Army, Navy, and support personnel. And part of the book is we give a lot of credit to the hundreds of people that made it happen.
Amen.
Yeah. It is a fascinating read, including the interviews that are contained in the back, especially from the POWs and what they went through. And so that's a great segue. What I'd like to do is just, Terry, it's a really fascinating description of your childhood. And so I just want to set people up, because you do become the youngest person on this raid, the youngest soldier. And there's a lot of firsts for you on this. So I'd like to just back up to you almost brushed over it with your childhood. Like, you didn't even have, I think it was running water or electricity for many years. Like, can you just talk us through briefly what Terry was like as a kid before we dive into this?
Sure. Growing up on a farm, I was born in a three-room house, and have two older brothers. When I came along, they tell me they expanded to a fourth room, and that's where my two brothers and I lived, and it was about the size of a POW cell. And but we all survived it, as the POWs did. And life on the farm was, we raised cattle, pigs, chickens, and did some grain farming. Later on, we farmed about 500 acres that my father rented. And so growing up on the farm was a fun life, enjoyed it. And I miss it in a lot of respects, but that's just what makes you what you are sometimes. And it was a good experience for me and my brother. My dad served in World War II and in the Philippines, and my oldest brother was 9 years in submarines, nuke subs in the Navy. My middle brother didn't pass his physical when he was drafted, so he stayed home and was a fireman for 25 years. So still wore a uniform and did his part for what was needed in the community at that time. And I've always felt it's been an honor and a blessing to serve with the men that I did serve with. As you know from the book, this was my first time in combat, and I just marvel sometimes at the opportunity to serve with men like Bull Simons, Dick Meadows, Colonel Sidnor, Pappy Kittleson, Jake Jakovenko. Dan Turner was my captain, and Dan kept me straight and saved my life more than once. Good man.
Yeah. Oh, and I definitely want to dig into that part with Captain Dan Turner. There are some items there that I want to explore, and I would almost back up here to as you're describing your family and this military history or tradition in the family. Did you and your father discuss combat before you went to Vietnam?
No, my dad took me to the bus station on my way to Kansas City to do the induction or doing my physical for the draft. And on the way in that morning, Dad had never really talked about what he did in combat in the Philippines. But one thing he told me that not to do is volunteer for anything. And as you can tell, I really paid attention to what he said.
Spoiler alert, that fell on deaf ears. Yeah.
Yes, it did. But his heart was in the right place, and he was looking out for me. And no, he didn't really talk a lot about what he did, and he had been awarded, I think, a Bronze Star in the Philippines. So
And I think later on, you guys have a discussion. Is that right, Terry, if I'm
Yes.
remembering it correctly? You finally do, but it's long after your
Right.
time.
Yeah, he had a stroke, and I used to go back up he was at the hospital in Columbia, Missouri there, and I lived in Kansas City. So on the weekends, I would go back up, and one weekend while there was just he and I, and we had an opportunity to share some of the stories of what we had gone through and what we experienced in combat, and also just in the military in general. It was I wished I'd have recorded it, but hindsight's always 20/20 on us. But good man, and he's a good father.
Yeah, it's funny. So I'm the youngest of four boys, and I've got my father flew Hueys in Vietnam for a tour. And then I have two older brothers. One flew Kiowa helicopters, and the other was a tank commander. And then I had another who just didn't find his way into the military. So a lot of similarities. And I did have a few discussions with my old man before I went over flying helicopters in Afghanistan, but certainly not as many as the discussions were not as rich as when I came back, and we had both kind of been through that and we talked about it. So it's really special to hear.
My daughter, what prompted, like Cliff was saying, I started the book in 2012. That's the year my daughter went to Afghanistan, and she was with the 82nd Airborne. And I started thinking back, and she started asking me, what did I do when I was in the military? And that's what prompted me to say, well, maybe I ought to put this in writing for her children's children. So the book was written, and I say it's not my book, it's our book, because there's a lot of other people that have contributed to the mission, but also to the book and what they did. And I learned a lot, and because there was three elements: red wine, green leaf, and blue boy, and we all had our separate mission statement while we were on that chopper. So some of the things that were going on in the green leaf I wasn't aware of, and they weren't aware of some of the things on red wine, and nobody knew what was going on in blue boy because they were kind of on their own inside the compound. But it was interesting to hear some of the stories from those guys, and those were included in the book as well. Yeah.
Oh, it's great. It's great. And then, Cliff, I might just hand this over to you for a moment. If you could explain, because your father played a special role in this as well. I mean, you guys fact check me if I'm wrong here, but I was trying to do the math between I know the way that the raid plays out, and we'll talk about this, is approached differently, but we're essentially talking about hundreds of miles behind enemy lines, right? Like into North Vietnam. And I think from where the North and South divide, it was like a 450-mile trek into North Vietnam. That's how deep we're talking about. And your old man was flying one of the aircraft going in. So I would just ask you if you could tee up what, first of all, fact check me on the numbers, but also if you could talk about your dad growing up and what his life was like as a pilot who was getting ready to go into that.
And what you're thinking of is Da Nang basically is the furthest north base that they possibly could have launched from in South Vietnam. But looking at it geographically, you can see that you're actually closer from certain parts of Thailand, and U Dorn Air Base is that base that's closest. Yeah. And so that's where they end up launching from. It's a 330-mile trip from U Dorn to the Son Tay POW camp. And just like you're saying, that whole 330 miles is hostile terrain because the northern part of Laos was, certainly unknowable, uncertain. And you had, best intel of where the safe areas were. And that's where they ended up choosing to eject from the F-105 that ends up having been shot down by a SAM. That's right at the end of the story. And it ends up having sort of a heart-lifting story about that because these guys, my father and a lot of the guys in both were involved in rescue. And so to have a rescue sort of top off the whole event is something that they live for. They really wanted to be a part of that rescue of that crew. So that 330 miles is something that especially, the last 150 from the North Vietnam border to Son Tay. That's where, you are in some of the most highly guarded airspace in the world.
Yeah. And so if you can, I think it takes a special pilot to want to go and do that or volunteer to do that. If you could tell us just a little bit about your father, what he was like, and just as we get set for this story.
A lot of the training takes place at Eglin Air Force Base, and that's with Special Ops MC-130s. But some of the resources were drawn from in-country resources. And launching from UDORN was actually not uncommon at all for my father. That was their normal TDY. They would go for a 3-day TDY of flying, 3 days with long missions. And the missions were either from sun up till about noon or from noon to sundown. And they would be on a constant alert looking for any Navy or Air Force or Army, anybody that gets shot down behind enemy lines. And in conjunction with the helicopters, and at this point in 1970, it was primarily HH-53s, but on the raid, they actually also use an HH-3. By this time, all the HH-43s, Pedros are already, retired or at least less and less used. So the key thing that made the Son Tay Raid possible, a technological leap, was that refueling of helicopters, air refueling of helicopters was made possible by the first aircraft that was able to do that is the HC-130P, which is what my dad was flying alert from UDORN constantly for that whole 12-month tour.
Wow. So perfect. Great setup here. What I would like to do then, Terry, just as we kind of talked about you talking to your old man, he takes you to the bus stop. You kind of you shared you're assigned to Bragg eventually. If you could, let's set the scene for how you find your way into the company of these other, I think, 56 Green Berets assigned or who volunteered for this mission. If you could take us to that point first.
Okay. I was at 7th Group at Fort Bragg, and I had been training up in Nantahala National Forest. And SF, you're either training or deployed. And I happened to be not deployed, but training. And when I was sent back to Bragg to get some supplies. And a couple of my buddies were telling me Bull Simons was down at the Little White House and was looking for volunteers for a mission. And so myself and a couple of my buddies decided we'd go down there and see what was going on, because Bull Simons is an icon in Special Forces. And I never met the man, all I knew was his reputation. And that in itself he's kind of like the John Wayne of Special Forces. And so we went down there, and I got down there. It was packed, the auditorium, with probably 500 plus Special Forces guys waiting to see what Bull had to say. And he came on stage, and it got dead quiet. And he had a little stogie, which he chewed on more than smoked, I think. And he said he was looking for men, volunteers for a moderately hazardous mission, and that we'd be back by Christmas. And there was no TDY, and which kind of eliminated some people. But he said, if you're interested in it, be back here at 1300 hours, and we'll start the interview process. And so, I thought, heck yeah, I'm game. And I had volunteered for Vietnam twice and never got a whiff of it. So next afternoon, or that afternoon, came back to the White House, and they sent us back to our barracks. There was a couple of command sergeant majors who were doing the interviewing. And I interviewed, and they asked me some questions to try to throw me off and want to know if I could weld. And growing up on a farm, we were always busting something. And Sam Chisholm, one of our neighbors, had welded everything for us. So I'd watched Sam weld a lot of pieces over the years and figured, hell, I can weld. So I told him I could. And then they wanted to know if I could scuba dive. And I said, no, I hadn't hadn't done scuba diving. But they thanked me for my time, and I thanked them and thought, well, at least they interviewed me. I went back to Natahaley. A few days later, and a colonel called me into his office and said, pack your bag, you're going back to Bragg. You were selected to go on this mission. Of course, nobody knew at that time anything about what it was. And, it was just a Bull Simons was looking for men. And I went and made my little debut there as we filled out our will, which was I'd been on several training missions and never filled out a will. But so I wrote a letter to my parents explaining what I had done and why, and gave it to one of my buddies and said, hold on to it. If I don't come back, mail it. And fortunately, I got to tear that letter up and when I got back. So, I went down on the advanced party and I was a grunt at that time because in Special Forces, the E5 Buck Sergeant is lowest rank. So I was kind of the private, if you will, but first did our thing now.
Yeah. So if you could, and, maybe Terry and or Cliff on this one, I think Bull Simons represents such an overarching character for this with kind of that lead role. And you were mentioning that he had this kind of storied background. Could you share a little bit more about what made him so special at the time before you participated in this raid?
The Bull?
Yeah.
Well, everybody in Special Forces knew Bull Simons, knew who he was. He was actually involved in the Philippines back in the days. We had two men on our group. Pappy Kittleson, unbeknownst at the time, was about to make history when he went on the raid. He was the only American to be on 4 POW raids. He was the youngest. He was 19 on the Cabanatuan POW raid in the Philippines to rescue 513 POWs. And he was a Iowa farm boy. And one thing I had on Pappy was a half an inch. Pappy I'm 5'6", and he was 5'5.5". But he had a lot more experience than I did, that's for sure. And he was just a great mentor as well. And but the Bull was just everybody knew Bull Simons, and you didn't question the man. And he was famous for getting guys, taking them into bad areas and bringing them home safely. And that's exactly what he did. I mean, how many Fulbergs do you know go on the ground when they're 56 years old?
I got to say, I think as people hear this interview and then read this book, will just be amazed that this was able to be executed the way it was, even with the hiccups that happened along the way, bringing people back. It is amazing that happened. And you're right. The fact that you got a Fulberg on the ground executing that is pretty phenomenal.
And he was, I have to tell you kind of how it came about. When I first went down there, the first thing we did was built the mock-up, and then the TOC building, the Air Force came in and did an inspection, making sure there was safe to hold our planning sessions in there. And then we put 3 rolls of concertina wire around and put a field phone out there. The only way you got in that building was somebody would come in, we'd call into the building, tell them who it was. They would send somebody out to escort them in. And we had guarded the building 24/7, and we had live ammo with the orders to shoot. And if anything went awry. And I was there one day, and it was just me and Colonel Simons, and he asked me how things were going. And I said, well, sir, I didn't come down here to pull guard duty, and I wanted to be on the mission, because what the guards were doing when we weren't guarding, we either sleeping or training with the troops. So we were pretty busy guys, and that went on for about a month. And it was, being a young buck and anxious and wanted to get on mission, not knowing really what it was. And so I told him what I thought, and he took that little stogie. I'll never forget. Took that stogie out, and he was about 6'1", 6'2", and he looked down at me and he says, "You just hang in there, young man. Things are going to change." And about a week and a half later, they made the first cut, and I didn't have full guard duty anymore. So
that's great.
I was happy about that.
That's great. And then, so what I want to do in just a second, I'm going to read an excerpt from the book, the mission as Colonel Simons relays it to you. I want to read through that because I think it sets some great context. I might just ask Cliff if you could. This mission is predicated on rescuing POWs. Could you give just some context of what the POW situation was like at the time and why this was so important to execute then? And I will just say a big plug for the book. The interviews in the back with folks who were POWs and what this raid meant to them, like it'll make your hair stand up. It'll probably make you cry reading it. So it's pretty special. So I would just say, Cliff, if you could set the scene with that, and then I want to read through the mission that Colonel Simons delivers.
Yeah. Most people are aware of the torture and the misery, the plight of the POWs. But I just want to point out the fact that the North Vietnamese would not acknowledge who they had. They wouldn't acknowledge where they were holding them, and of course wouldn't allow third parties to come and verify that they were, alive and healthy. But they wouldn't even tell it how many POWs you had. But in May of 1970, it was estimated there were about 335. Maybe the way to say that is at least 335. And the opportunity to ever see a POW, meaning reconnaissance or intel asset, would only be when the propaganda films were released. And so, those were at the zoo downtown and a Hanoi Hilton. So those interior POW camps were something that you could never hope to spring them from. It's not the kind of thing where a rescue mission would ever be feasible in the downtown POW camps. But in May of 1970, for the first time, there were signals sent that were received by both SR-71 and Buffalo Hunter drones, which would fly, they'd be screaming at, say a couple hundred feet over, just sort of crisscrossing through. And in May of 1970, they as a matter of fact, some of the POWs give this story in the book. Leroy Stutz is one who describes how they would try to arrange the laundry in ways that would be signals that intel would recognize. Like, for instance, a K is a symbol that indicates that they could be, available for rescue. Also, an arrow, they laid out laundry in a way that the arrow would point to maybe a way that you might be able to enter from. And maybe putting a P, an O, and a W. And in the book, we asked Leroy Stutz, one of the POWs who did it, to actually sort of recreate in an artist's rendition of what kind of symbols he laid out. So it was pure misery. And Son Tay was about 23 miles outside to the northwest of Hanoi, to where we, one, knew that Americans were there, two, that we thought there was a chance that a rescue could be planned. And that's when the Pentagon, it's Colonel Norman Frisbee and General Blackburn, who put together a feasibility study to try to see if they could come up with a reasonable rescue plan. And that's happening in May of 1970. And by July 4th or 1st, somewhere around there, when Admiral Thomas Moore takes over as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they've got it in a good enough form to present it to him. And he enthusiastically receives that and gives some assets, budget, and commitment to make the next phase happen. That first phase up to this point that I described is called Operation Polar Circle. That's that feasibility study happening in the DIA headquarters. Actually, they wanted to get out of the Pentagon as quickly as possible, meaning they didn't trust that it wouldn't leak. So they wanted to get a very secure place. And what they chose is in the Arlington area. It's called Arlington Hall, which is part of the Defense Intelligence Agency. And that's where they did all this planning, including building a diorama that shows the exact layout from all the imagery, putting their best description of what the interior of the Son Tay compound looks like for the Green Berets to start planning a mission. So up to that point, up to about July 1st, it's called Operation Polar Circle. After that, as they start to get into committing air assets, special forces assets, and then of course at Eglin, the facilities, a secret facility where they can plan it, that becomes called Operation Ivory Coast.
So thanks for the setup there, Cliff. That's perfect description of what's going on with the POW situation and then some of the training preparation sites for this. I'm just going to read what Bull Simon describes as the mission. So this is the colonel leading this. For those who are listening on a podcast and not watching this on YouTube, you might, I'm going to have a picture of Bull on here that you can see. So I encourage you to look at it to envision the way he might say it with a stogie or whatever it is in his mouth, because his picture is it's what you want from this colonel going on this mission, right?
Exactly.
So if you can picture this 6'1", 6'2", crew cut guy with the stogie with the map behind him, he says the following: "We are going to rescue 70 American prisoners of war, maybe more, from a camp called Son Tay. The target is 23 miles west of Hanoi. This is something our American prisoners of war have a right to expect from their fellow soldiers. We are all part of the same military family. We want these men to know that they are not abandoned by their military family. No man should feel that way. That's why we are going in there after them. You are to let nothing interfere with this operation. Our mission is to rescue prisoners, not to take prisoners. If there's a leak, we'll know it by the time the second or third chopper sets down. If we're walking into a trap, if it turns out that they know we're coming, don't even dream about walking out of North Vietnam unless you've got wings on your feet. We'll be 100 miles from Laos. It's the wrong part of the world for a retrograde maneuver. If it happens, I want to keep this force together. We'll back up to the Song Kong River if we have to, and by God, they're welcome to come across that damned open ground. We'll make them pay for every foot across that son of a bitch." So I loved reading that. I think it just sets a great tone. If you could, Terry, when you were hearing that, what was it like for the folks? Where were you at the time? Was this at Eglin early on in the process?
No, this was, we had no idea where we were going till we actually got, when Bull Simons came on stage that night, and we were supposed to be there at 1800 hours. It was a little, I'd say a theater. It was probably set maybe 75 to 100 people, and the old wood benches, and he was down on stage and had a big map of North Vietnam, had a big red circle around Hanoi and another one around Son Tay. And when he finished his little talk there, I mean, it was just dead silence, for, maybe 5 seconds at the most. And then it was just like everybody jumped up and was yelling, hollering and whistling and saying, "Let's go get them. That's what we're here for." And Bull kind of calmed everybody back down and said, this is a strictly volunteer mission. We have a 50-50 chance of not making it back. And he said, if anybody wants to back out now's the time to do it. Nobody did. And he said, okay, go back to your billets and grab your gear and go to the hangar. We had a hangar there where we had our weapons and radios and all of our stuff, ammo and all that stored. And we got that, checked our weapons, checked our gear, batteries for our radios and all that. And put us on a 130 and flew us up to Udorn.
That's crazy.
Morale was above and beyond. I mean, for 3 months, we had been wondering where in the hell. There was all kind of rumors, first because of the flight pattern of, we did a couple of 3.5-hour flights. The old timers saying, well, we're going to Cuba, something going on in Cuba because we were in Eglin and about a 3-hour flight over to Cuba, they thought. So, and then there was a lot of aircraft that had been hijacked. So we knew it was some type of rescue mission based on the training we did. Because what we did, there was 109 guys went down there and 56 of us went on the mission. And, but we used the support guys were just as important because we all had backups too. If something went wrong with us for whatever reason, everybody had a backup. And so we had plenty of people willing to go on the mission, not knowing what it was. But the guys that were supporting us, they would take them out to buildings and put them in there, and then they'd hide. And then they would have guys that were say that they had fraternized with the enemy, and the other guards or other POWs wanted to kill them. So we had to be able to handle that. Those were the type of scenarios they threw at us. And, so we knew it was some type of rescue, but we just didn't know what or where. But when he told us where we were going and the odds are coming back, nobody even flinched. They just said, okay, let's go get them. And so we went over, got our gear, checked it out. And I remember all the old timers coming up to me because I was the kid of the group. And they were telling Dan Turner, get his ass back here in one piece, And, told me the one thing they kept telling me, don't hesitate. If you got an opportunity to do it, because you may not get the second one. So,
and I know you do, and we will get into that because and we got to talk about Dan Turner still. I might just ask Cliff if this is an appropriate time because OPSEC is critical here. Like you guys are training for months, right, Terry? I think it says 170 training missions on target. Is that right?
Rehearsals, yes.
Rehearsals. And that's interesting. I've interviewed a dozen folks who are from the special ops community, Green Berets, Rangers, Delta folks, SEALs. And the commonality, like there are several commonalities that are emerging now, but one of them is just practice. The amount of practice that goes in for execution is unlike anything I experienced in the conventional side. And it sounds like that's what you were part of.
Exactly. When I talk to military people, groups, I always say, we all hate training, but training saved our ass. I'm a firm believer of that. When we went to Plan Green, it was like no big deal. We've done.
You just knew.
Times. We knew exactly what to do. I got to tell you, the anxiety was a little high, but it was almost like we were back training, except bullets were coming this way. Made a little difference out of it, but the reaction of the guys from all of them was the same. I mean, Greenleaf, Blue Boy, Red Wine, everybody, just because of the training, the only thing we didn't train for is not having POWs. Of course, we didn't know we were going to have them to start with. And then what happens when Greenleaf come back in after landing the facility. But, it was good. The training was real.
Yeah. Oh, man. No, it's just so interesting.
I did want to say that right here, Terry's kind of pointed to a feature of the book that is truly from Terry's heart, and it has to do with life lessons. There are 9 life lessons spread throughout the book, and 2 of them that come to mind that we just mentioned was, one, how did he have a reason to think that his job as guarding the TOC, the Tactical Operations Center, it just seemed like it was the low man on the totem pole. But the lesson that he learned, so he shares out of this, is you never know how significant your job is. It may seem insignificant to you, but you need to always do your best because it could be life-changing. In this case, Terry tells the story how Bull specifically mentions that if security had been compromised, well, you're gonna find out pretty soon on this mission. And Terry mentions in the book that he thinks back to that time that he was responsible for operations security at the Tactical Operations Center. The second lesson that I think of right there is about the importance of training, that, it's a matter of maturity where you have to take your training seriously. You have to seek it out at all opportunities and do your best in the training as well, even though you might think it's boring for you. It's going to really make the difference at some point, either for you or for someone next to you.
Yeah, I make the analogy of a football team. You don't get to the Super Bowl by not training.
Yeah.
And this was our Super Bowl. The only difference was it was a life or death situation, not a $1 million winner.
It's so true. And Cliff, I actually wanted to talk about this OPSEC component because, as you just described, Terry, you guys didn't know exactly where you were going until literally the last moment. But Cliff, I would imagine as pilots, they had to have route planned this in advance, right? So was there separation amongst the ground forces and the aviators to avoid that discussion? Because I would imagine they have to think through this, especially at night.
Yes, and let me mention John Gargis. John Gargis retired as a colonel. At the time, he was a major. He was one of the main planners. He was a navigator for one of the MC-130s that would take in. And John is so generous with his time and his effort to share all this background of what was going on. He was heavily involved in our 50th anniversary ceremony celebrations this past November. And he's a good friend of Terry's and mine. Matter of fact, Terry and John and I are going to be on a panel at Texas Tech University here in another 2 weeks, sharing at the Vietnam Center that's in honor of Congressman Sam Johnson, who was a POW. He's passed away now, but the archive there is named in his honor. And the operations security was something where the certain, as you can imagine, compartmented information. So the A1 aircraft were provided in country, but the A1 Sky Raider pilots actually were all brought in from Eglin. So they were training at Eglin, and the Green Berets were training at Duke Field, which is on Eglin Air Force Base, but it's an auxiliary field. Auxiliary field number 3 at Eglin is Duke Field. And in the book, we sort of show the differentiation of how secretive. Terry's probably got a couple of stories on that. I want to mention one other thing before I hand it off, though. The colonel who's in charge of security, his name's Max Newman. He's a real German kind of a guy, and his call sign is Blue Max, which is after the German medal. And he is very, very tight-lipped even now, because even trying to interview him, it's kind of hard to get past him. But he'll share little bits of information. Terry, I think you ought to share that one about the Air Force guys who were taking photographs at Duke Field.
Yeah. What he was talking about, we were coming in one night, and once we had been training, most of our training started at night then. And probably, I would say 60% of our training was night training. We'd go through it 3 times a night. And we were coming in one night, and it was just about dusk. And there was some Air Force guys that were taking pictures of us coming off the choppers, because they were landing right down from where our barracks was. And all of a sudden, these 2 cars pulled up, and next thing you know, they're taking their film and dumping it out, handing them back their cameras. I mean, these guys came from nowhere. And I'm sure the Air Force boys thought, holy crap, what have we done?
Yep.
But that just, our security was very, very tight while we were there at Eglin. I know, in the 3 months we were there, they brought in a band one night and brought in some girls. And we later found out that these were ladies of the military that were trying to find out if us young bucks were loose-lipped or not. But we held our own, and we kept our mouths shut.
That's impressive.
Yeah.
I love it.
They looked at every nook and cranny on us, I guess. And, Friday night was our Friday night fights. We had a lot of fights internally, but that's just normal, a little hooch in you, and you have a tendency to think you can whip the world there. And so, but.
Well, I mean, you guys were contained there. I mean, you didn't have, there's no TDYs, there was no communication, right? Like you were just by yourself. So I think it was even more of a pressure cooker.
Yeah, we got mail and we could make a phone call, but the phones were bugged and we found out later and our mail was checked. So Tyrone Adderley, who slept next to me, we were in the old barracks, World War II barracks. And I used to steal his letters because his wife, Gloria, she used to put perfume on them. And I would take them and put them under my pillow. And Adderley would come in, where's my mail? You didn't get mail. But,
I love it.
Yeah, just little fun things we had. But,
yeah, the things that go on amongst soldiers, right? So,
yeah.
So I wanted to talk a bit now about Captain Turner, right? So
Dan Turner.
Please fact check me if I get this wrong, Terry. You were selected, like handpicked, to be his RTO for this operation, right? Not just any old person. Like you were going to be the right hand man of this captain going into this fight.
Yes.
I want to read another segment out of the book that when you ask him why he chose you, right? And to your point, Cliff, this comes after one of the life lessons.
And this was asked several years after, because I always wondered, how did I get selected? You know, who made the final? I want that guy.
Yeah.
And
it's important because he gets it right? Like we learn once you guys hit the ground, you got it right. So here's what he says: amongst all these Green Berets, seasoned vets that he could have chosen from, he chooses you, right? So he says, during training, I noticed you and your gung-ho attitude. You responded positively to any and all tasking, didn't give any bullshit excuses, and got things done without a lot of supervision. You were in great physical shape if I needed you to carry my butt out. Plus, there was that intangible thing, the stuff you can't really define. When I looked in your eyes, I knew I wanted you as my RTO. There was just something about the way you carried yourself that told me you were way beyond the experience level of an average 20-year-old. The only approval I needed was Colonel Bud Sidner, and he approved without any questions, right?
Yep.
Could you just talk about the relationship you had with him at the time? I know it was short-lived, but like it probably felt like a very long time based on the type of anxiety you described and what you went into together.
Dan was just a great mentor to me. And, I screwed up a couple of times and he let me know it. I remember one incident, we were going through the process of, we were a two-man group. There was a two-man team. In fact, we were the only two-man team on the mission. And I was a few feet away from him, and he looked over at me and did one of these numbers. When he did that, I thought, I'm in trouble now. I walked over there, and he stuck his arm out, and he says, "You see that?" I said, "Yes, sir." He says, "You're going to be that close to me, and if you're not, I'll shoot you." And I always believed he would have shot me. That's just Dan's way of making sure I got the message. And but Dan saved my life a couple of times on the raid, and vice versa. So it's just the way it worked. And when Dan passed away, it was a real a loss for the Son Tay Raiders. And I'm still very close to the family, his wife Barb, and the kids, his kids. So, that's, you've got friends that you're like that too, and how it works. So
it's special.
Yep, it is. Can't describe it
about that closeness, like family. One way you can kind of get a little taste for that is on our Facebook page for the Son Tay Raid Association. You see what Terry's talking about. You've got family members of so many of the Raiders, and they're, remembering and appreciating each other. Of course, their relative, but also these other friends and that they've known through these brothers. This truly like a band of brothers. What we're talking about, families associated.
Now we're down to 22 Raiders out of the 56. So. Things are Old age is catching up.
Yeah. Oh, I hate hearing that. Cliff, I'm going to direct this to you, Terry, if it's more appropriate that you answer it, please. I want to start getting into the mission and talk a little bit about the task organization, right? Because there's a lot of moving pieces here. You mentioned it, red wine, blue boy, there's lime, the apples, right? I just want to give people an idea of the force that's going in. And just also, again, for context, we're talking about a 3-hour flight of 3 helicopters. There's fixed wing that's leading the way. We got no night vision, right? So all these people who are looking at what we do today, try to imagine going into the heart of enemy territory, no night vision at night when most people don't fly at night. Especially, like my old man would tell me, like they rarely flew at night in Vietnam, right? Because you didn't have the capability. So the lighting had to be right. You're going in. You didn't even know exactly where you're going until moments before. Like, this is a crazy raid. It's amazing how it worked so well. So, Cliff, if you could set the stage of the task organization, who's doing what on this?
Yeah. Now, it developed over the months of September and October, but the final plan ended up being what Terry was describing as the speech from Bull Simons that you read. That happened at the CIA compound at Takli Royal Thai Air Force Base. And then it's about a 30-minute flight. Like Terry said, they hop on a C-130 that's just to transport them to Udorn. And there they walk on the flight line direct to their helicopters. The helicopters are lights out. There is going to be no external radio calls among the HH-53s and HH-3. There'll be no calls to ground, no calls to tower. And as a matter of fact, they've got a colonel up in the air traffic control tower to say at this moment, don't ask any questions. Of course, make sure nothing else is moving at Udorn. And so they taxi out and take off. It is Cherry 1. I'm sorry. First, it's Lime 1 is the HC-130P that the 5 H-53s form up on and 1 HH-3. So it's 6 helicopters behind 1 aircraft. And that HC-130P, Lime 1, and then there's Lime 2 is airborne with them as well. So Lime 1 leads that entourage to the North Vietnam border. At that join-up point, they meet with the MC-130 that then takes lead. All 6 aircraft, all 6 helicopters transition over to the MC-130, Cherry 1, and that Cherry 1 takes them on to the Son Tay POW camp. They have an IP at which they're everybody, including A1s. Now, A1 Sky Raiders, they all have 2 pilots in them. They seat 4, but they've only got 2. That's very common. So 2 pilots per A1, and those A1 Sky Raiders are with the call sign Peach. So you can see the theme there. Somebody at the Pentagon thought that a fruit salad, would be combat, kick-ass, scare the enemy out of their shorts, And so anyway, so the Peach aircraft, 5 of them form up on a second MC-130, which is also basically they were supposed to form up over Vientiane, so that being in the southern part of Laos, but they carry them all the way to that IP. And then everybody's going to enter basically from due west of Son Tay and come straight on in. Everything has to be timed around the slowest aircraft. And the slowest aircraft is the HH-3. Now, it's called the Jolly Green Giant, and the HH-53 is called the Super Jolly Green Giant. But they were having to do this at 105 knots. And for a C-130 to be at 105 knots, they're real close to stall speed. So it's an intense flight at 1,000 AGL. So this whole thing with the buffeting of, thermals, and it's difficult enough, with the terrain, the ups and downs of the terrain. But it's also at night and no radios. So it's just a spectacular feat that required that much training and planning and commitment and professionalism.
And Cliff, I mean, no GPS either, right? Like this is map navigation at night, limited comms, multi-ship formation, mixed aircraft, helos and fixed wing, madness, right? Like just crazy going in here.
And the only time that a radio call is made, there is one call just sort of in the blind made that is the wind corrected bearing that they would be coming in from the IP to help the helicopters know what's going to get them to there. But they need to, of course, stay with Cherry 1 all the way to it. And then the first time that radios are used is when Cherry 1 rises to 1500 AGL, rises to 1500 AGL. So they've been so low this whole time. And then rises to a 1500 AGL and says alpha, alpha, alpha. And at that point, then, you're free to use the radios all you want.
Sorry, just quickly, Cliff, why choose 1,000 AGL, so 1,000 feet above ground level? Would you not want to be lower, or is it just a safety factor? Like, we don't really know what's out there. Let's just maintain this safer altitude.
Yeah, the real answer is that there is going to be some stacking in that formation, and that so Lime is at 1,000. Cherry is going to take over the formation by coming under them. So Cherry 1 comes under because the helicopters, they've got no smash. Their only energy they're going to get is by going downward. So they're going to descend to Cherry 1 and take over from there. That's all the way from the, basically from the North Vietnam border.
All right.
That last 120 miles.
Jeez. So Terry, thanks for letting us nerd out a little bit on the aviation side here. That's fascinating for me to hear, and I know a lot of folks who are pilots will love hearing this.
Well, it was on the flight in. You get up, walk around a little bit. You got a lot of time to think. And what kept going through my mind, my buddy was getting married that night. One of my best friends was getting married that night back in Clark, Missouri, and here I was, halfway around the world. And, it looked like you could reach out and touch the trees as we were flying. Our pilots, my hat is off to those guys. I mean, they knew what the heck they were doing. And it was a quarter moon, so we could see looking out and seeing the other aircraft. It was quite a view. I wished I'd had a camera because it was a neat picture to see that and where we were at. And but they did a hell of a job. And
yeah. And Tara, I wanted to ask, so you're 20 years old at the time, is that right? Do I have that right? So you're right. 20. This is the first combat experience you're about to go into, right? And I had interviewed Tom Satterley, who was a Delta operator for 20 years. His first combat, really, the way he describes it, is Black Hawk Down, right? Like that was his first foray into combat. And as I was reading this, I was like, holy crap, Terry is doing the same thing. Like he's going into this monumental event for his first experience. So, you said there's a lot of anxiety. You're getting up, walking around. Can you just dive in a little bit more? Like what was going through your head, if you can remember?
Well,
on that.
I have a very vivid memory of it. When I first got on the boat or ship, looking around, all the guys were sitting down and getting comfortable. And these guys, were laughing, talking to one another. And then other guys were either sleeping or praying, had their eyes closed. And, it was about a 3.5 hour flight. So you had a lot of time to think about, at 20 years old, my short life passed in front of me, and then knowing my buddies were getting married at that time. And, it just, you had a lot of time to pray. And that's for sure. And I did some heavy praying, and thank God he was listening. But it was just amazing. And when we started tethering in to land, it just seemed like we were on another training at that point. And as we were, Cherry 1 came up, dropped the flares. And we started tethering down to land, And that's about the time I had a headset on, so I had one ear covered and one ear open so I could hear Captain Turner tell me what to do or what not to do. And we were the last ones off our ship. And just as we were sitting down, the call sign came on and it said "Playing Green," and I couldn't believe I heard what I heard. So I said, "Say again," and they came back, alternate Playing Green. Sergeant Howell, SF Howell, said going to Playing Green, and I looked at Dan Turner and I told him, Dan, Captain Turner, it's Playing Green. And he looked at me with that old shit look like, you got to be kidding. He said, "Are you kidding?" I said, "No, sir." And he said, "Well, pass it on." So, and about that time, our mission, if it changed, what you would do is just pass it to the next guy. So everybody on the ship knew we were going to Playing Green. Well, Playing Green to us meant that Greenleaf had been shot down or had mechanical problems, but it was not with us anymore. And there were 22 guys on that ship. So we went from 56 minus 22.
Yeah.
And they had a lot of firepower on theirs. They had, 60 cal machine gun carrying it and M79 grenade launchers. And their job was to take care of the guard house. And all of a sudden that became our mission. And Red Wine became the assault chopper. And we had about 5 or 6 guys doing what, 22 guys were going to do. But our minigun opened up on that. And, that was a real thrill for me to stand, a couple of feet from the minigun. And that thing fired off about 4,000 rounds. It seemed, very, So but it was still a training mission in my mind, actually. I mean, I tell, I didn't get, I was not afraid as much as I was excited about we're finally doing what we've been training to do.
So we're coming in, we're short final basically. There are flares deployed, right? That's Cherry 2, I think you said. So this is like the only illumination they're going to get out besides the moon to come in and land. Cliff, if you could describe, like, here's what was supposed to happen, and then Terry, I'm going to pass it to you for Playing Green, which is an audible at the last minute, change everything we had just planned for and execute this audible, right? So Cliff, here's what it should look like. And then let's talk about the military reality of no plan, surviving first contact.
Oh, yeah. So at the point when Cherry 1, who has been leading all 6 aircraft to this point, at the point that they pull up, there is 2 key aircraft, two key helicopters. The first one that's going to go over the compound is Apple III. It is strictly with the role of a gunship, and it's using those miniguns that Terry was just talking about to shoot at the 2 guard towers that are going to be the first threat. 2 guard towers that are on the west wall, so at the northwest and the southwest. So as you come in from the west, and it's pretty much due west, coming in from the west, they slow down 20 feet above the wall and are shooting in both directions. Now, the 2 miniguns are taking out those guard towers, and that happens like clockwork. Nothing except the original plan. Then he passes over and turns right, takes out a barracks area. Now, everything's going just great, Okay, and then the second key aircraft is Banana. Banana is that HH-3, the slowest one. It has the assault force. That's the Blue Boy Assault Group. And those men are the ones who are going to land inside the compound, and it's sort of basically a planned crash landing. And that also goes as planned. Well, when those 2 aircraft with this Cherry 1 departed the rest of them needed to find a little bit of a separation because they're going to come in right after Blue Boy comes in. Well, unfortunately, they started drifting off to the right, and they, of course, are very low. And there happens to be, and it was already pre-briefed, there happened to be something that looked a lot like the POW compound. In all the briefings, it was known as the secondary school. And the secondary school, you know, they didn't know exactly what it was. It was clearly something military. Maybe early on it looked like a school kind of campus, but unfortunately that wind drift and the fact that, you know, like you were saying, you don't have GPS, you don't have INS, you're just going to be at the whim of the wind, and it really got them heavily. So in that last mile prior to the camp, they had drifted off enough to the right to where they started to see the first lights, and that was the secondary school. Well, all of the aircraft recognize it at the last moment. They're literally over, and you can see the flight plan in the Joint Chiefs Staff after action report. They actually all went over the secondary school and did a hard, and I'm talking like 90-degree left bank, and went on to the Son Tay POW camp, which was due north of that. Unfortunately, now you got flares, you've got some explosions, you've got a battle simulator going off. It's in the confusion of it. The last aircraft to the farthest to the right, so everybody else is peeled off to the left. He couldn't see. He was already focused, and he goes and lands right there at the secondary school. It's Apple One. It has green leaf on it, and lets off those 22 Green Berets there at the secondary school. The bottom line is they treated it just like it was the Son Tay POW camp, but in their write-ups afterwards, they say, I mean, it's just pretty obvious. Within a few steps, you're out there and you're getting to your area, but within a few seconds, you already know this is not the POW camp. For instance, there are no two-story buildings at the actual Son Tay POW camp, and one that you see right there prominent is a two-story building. And the best they can do is take out what they can, because they immediately start receiving fire. It's a pretty substantial firefight that happens. Apple One has already left, is already departing. And so, and Apple One quickly gets told, this is not it. Well, that moment when everyone realized that Apple One was not there, that's that moment that Terry was talking about when it was announced, Plan Green, which means we do not have Green Leaf support group with us at Son Tay POW camp.
Terry, so you're 20 years old, you're hopping off the aircraft, you got an audible, you're with Captain Dan Turner, right? So just take us through this raid, please.
At that time, our minigun opened up, and we started off, our chopper sat down, and we were deplaning, and Dan was right in front of me, and I was following him off. And as we were stepping off the back of the chopper, my first encounter with him was, there was one of the guards from the inside the compound was coming out, and he was firing at Dan. And, you know, this was the moment you don't hesitate. And one of the things that we had was a new scope that we had been using and trained with. And our accuracy from night firing went from misses of about 50 to hits to about 90 to 95. And the idea was all you had to do is put that dot on what you wanted to shoot and pull the trigger. And, you know, first thing I did was put the dot on the boy's chest and pulled the trigger. And got Dan and clear, and we got off. So, and from there we started doing our own, the guys on the red wine that knew what Plan Green was went to their mission, and we had our mission. Our job was, my job was to get to the radio communication building as quickly as we could, because, you know, we're 20 miles from Hanoi. Now, it doesn't take long to drive 20 miles. The planners gave us 30 minutes on the ground before we had reinforcements coming in. Now, Cliff was talking about the A1Es. Those guys were flying a figure eight above us. So we had an A1E over us at any time. And we were supposed to blow the bridge going over the river, and for any troops coming from Hanoi. Well, because of Plan Green, we didn't have the resources to blow the bridge, so that was turned over to the A1E guys, keep their eye on it. If anything started up that, take it out, and that was their job. I might add, too, that one of the important parts of the planning was when the planners were looking at the POWs, they didn't know what the orders were for the guards. So when they were doing the planning on this, the reason we crashed inside the compound, we wanted to be able to take out the guards. And they figured within a minute we had to control the inside of for the guards. So if they were ordered to shoot, the POWs, we had to take them out first. So that was one of the reasons why they crashed inside the compound. And they did a great job of getting it in and getting out and nobody getting hurt in the crash other than one Air Force guy. A fire extinguisher fell off and broke his ankle. But and then Joe Murray got shot in the back of the leg on red wine, our element. But the guy that did that didn't live to tell about it either. But anyway, that was part of it. But I still to this day believe that the guys on Greenleaf saved the mission, because that group down there was roughly 100 of them, and they were not Vietnamese based on what our guys told us. And those guys could have been up there in a heartbeat, and we would have really been fighting a lot more than we expected. And so I think the element of surprise took out those guys and give us the ability to go ahead and do Plan Green. And they executed that great. I mean, our guys on paper or on red wine did a good job. Apple One went back, picked up their Greenleaf, brought them back and dropped them off just like they would in the real thing. Now, it took a little bit of communications to get them caught up with the red wine guys, but that happened pretty quickly. And Dan and I had cleared a couple of buildings we needed to clear on our way to the commo shed. When we got to the commo shed and we were getting ready, what would we do? We'd throw a concussion grenade in. That would blow things apart in there. And then Dan would hit the ground, and I would swing over him, and we'd just do a crossfire inside the building. Because Bull Simons had told us, take no prisoners. And we had to come back through that same area. So we wanted to make sure everybody was neutralized so we wouldn't be held back and couldn't get back on our ships to get back to Udorn. So on the way through there, just as we got to the commo shed, that's when I heard on my headset, negative items. Now, items was a code word for POWs. And I looked at Dan and I said, Dan, or Captain Turner, it's negative items. And he said, are you sure? And I said, I just heard it. And we went ahead and went in the commo shed just to make sure. But there was nobody in the commo shed. They'd already beat feet out of there. And but we don't know. I don't think they would have been able to make a call that quick, but they may have. But regardless, we were heading out of there anyway. So that's when they started extract. And so we started pulling back from the same place we just came through, knowing that everybody was neutralized in that respect. And got back to our choppers. And I will say one thing, the CIA in the mock-up they made, Barbara, was a replica of the compound and the surrounding area. And when we weren't practicing, we would go in. It's about a 6-foot by 5-foot layout of the compound, and they gave you a little prism, and you would take that prism and you look down through that prism, and it looked like you were on the ground at the same height you would be if you were standing there. So you could get acclimated as quickly as you could. And one of the things the CIA had made was a little bitty bicycle, which wasn't but about an inch or two long, sitting out in front of the commo shed. Being from Missouri, you got to show me. I looked at that, and there was that damn bicycle.
No way.
Yes, it was. That just amazed me. Now, the one thing that was off a little bit, we had taken a chainsaw in to cut down the light poles for our LZ to bring the choppers back. Well, the problem with the light poles, they weren't wood, they were concrete. So chainsaws don't cut concrete. So the guys doing our LZ had to move it out a little bit further to bring the choppers back in. So we started coming back in, we got on the choppers and we started doing a head count, and we were one man short. So we did another head count and we were still one man short. And then, you know, that chopper wasn't leaving until we had a full head count. And then the next time around, Dan counted himself. And so we had and we got on the bird and took off. And that's when it got hairy for us. Dan and I, there was a PJ set between us. I was on the left side, Dan was on the right side. And as the chopper lifted up and turned, we were looking over the lights of Hanoi. And, you know, I'm thinking Hanoi's got little bitty, you know, grass huts and everything. This looked like a major city that you could fly into a major Kansas City or, you know, Chicago, someplace like that. And we hadn't been in the air probably, I bet we weren't in there 30, 40 seconds or maybe a minute. I don't know. It went by pretty quick. And all of a sudden our chopper just dropped like it was going down. I thought we were crashing. And that's when this light pole ran up our tail. And I had never seen a SAM, and I hollered over at Captain Turner, what was that? And he looked at me, I don't know. And the PJ sat between us and said, that was a SAM. And we were going, oh my God. And that's when it really, to me, got a little scary, because we're setting ducks, you know, up there. And, you know, I had never anticipated having a SAM take us out. You know, if my feeling was, if I'm going to get taken out, it'll be a VC or someone like that doing it, not a SAM missile. But I got a real appreciation for what pilots go through.
Well, I got to say, there's a funny comment earlier on in the book. I think it's when Colonel Simons, when the Bull is initially looking for recruits, and he says that I've got a moderately hazard operation for people. And I think later on after you execute it, you're like, if that's moderate, what is high risk for this guy, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what went through my mind on that flight in. You know, moderately hazardous, and be back by Christmas. But it was a very positive attitude.
Yeah. If I can ask you, Terry, when you're on the objective, and I think you guys correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're on the ground for 27 minutes, if that's right. I mean, sounds like a long time based on what you just said, but it probably felt like an eternity, right? What, when you heard the no items, right, no POWs present, what went through your mind?
What in the heck went wrong? Why? And, you know, it was just like all this training. And I mean, we were so geared up to bring back POWs. I mean, that's all we could talk about on the way from Udorn, and just thinking about the families, what they're going to go through. They're going to have a great Christmas this year. You know, they're going to be able to celebrate. And it was like, you know, stick in the heart, you know. And, but, you know, the good thing that happened, and I think Cliff had responded to what the POW. Cliff, you want to pick that up?
Yeah, I really do, because this is something that history needs to rethink. Historians very often use the word failure. They say it failed to get any POWs. But the case that we lay out in the book is that it was absolutely a success. And that's because of the priority of the mission was to send the message. And that is, of course, get as many POWs as you can. But when you do the math, if there were 60 or 70 POWs at Son Tay POW Camp, think about it's a total of 335. You're getting something like 15% of the POWs. So for people to say that it was a failure when the mission overall was not just to grab a few, but it was to have the strategic effect on all the POWs, and that is namely to make sure the North Vietnamese know that we will come for our own, that the POWs have not been forgotten, that it was inevitable that the POWs everywhere, at all the POW camps, were going to hear that America does care. Now, remember that they were being basically brainwashed day by day. I would say many or most of the POW camp cells had a little radio. The one thing they did is within earshot, they had a radio speaker that was pumping, Hanoi Hannah into their brains all the time. And the message to them was that your country is in disarray. All of the peace movement and the way that veterans are being treated in America proves that America does not care about you as a POW sitting in a cell that nobody even knows is dead or alive. Nobody knows where you are, and that your country, your government, doesn't even care enough to try to do something. They're not even trying, like they'd like to say that at the negotiating table, there was not enough. They could send you home if they would just stop the aggressive behavior that was being pumped into their mind. Bottom line, in the end, every last POW got the message, and the POWs tell their stories in the book of how amazing it was for them to know that their country, their military brothers cared about them.
At one of our reunions, Commander Doug Clower, who was the SRO at Son Tay, he got up at one of our reunions and said that if anybody thinks the Son Tay Raid was a failure, he said they need to come and talk to me, because he said we all, and he was talking about the POWs, agree that the Son Tay Raid was one of the best things that happened to us, because from that time on, they started getting better treatment. The beatings quit. They brought them all together in one cell where they had 50 or 60. They started teaching classes. They were able to help one another and that were sick. Because some of these guys were on their last leg and needed assistance, feeding and getting them showered and get them cleaned up and things like that. So some lives were saved there. The POWs have some great stories. I mean,
yeah.
David Ford, who was a POW for 6-7 years, is in one of the camps, and they brought in a doctor who was French, the North Vietnamese did. And the doctor didn't speak Vietnamese, but he spoke French, and one of the POWs in the compound spoke French, and they were talking, and he was telling him about David. He had a really bad abscessed tooth, and it needed to be pulled. And the French doctor said, well, I will get that taken care of. In fact, I'll have him bring some Novocaine as well. So a couple of days later, they brought a doctor in and a nurse, and they took David out, and they kind of tapped on the tooth, find out which one was bad, and reached in and pulled it out. And when they got it pulled out, then they gave him a shot of Novocaine in the arm. And
what?
David, when David unfortunately has passed on, but he could tell that story really good.
Cliff, go ahead. It looks like you were. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, Terry. Keep going.
No, that's just the way they. Some of the stories they have tell, about what's going on and how they did things. My hat, man, I'll tell you, they're my heroes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Terry, I wanted to point out that other life lesson that you have, that is that people need to add humor. They need to make an effort to contribute some humor. Everybody needs to find a way. If the POWs in their misery could find ways to tell stories to each other, get each other chuckling, then as a life lesson, you need to be that kind of a positive person that tries to add some humor and see humor, appreciate humor. And Terry is one that throughout his book, he'll add some humor. He'll tell and he'll appreciate good humor.
I got to say, like, the fight nights come to mind. There's some other ones about the humor aspect, and I would just say, like, people who are listening have heard a lot of the raid, but there's so much in the book that's just worth the sidebars, the personalities, the interviews. And I have 2 segments I want to read from the POWs, because I mean, it's gut wrenching reading some of these, like what they went through. It's really, really difficult. But, like I think people who listen to this podcast would probably appreciate this type of thing. But in their own words, these are POWs at the time describing they were at other camps nearby or had heard about this. So one of them is Air Force Captain Leon Lee Ellis, right? So he was at the Son Tay POW camp from 67 to 73, right? So part of what he says is, though we were not rescued by the raid is capitalized like this event. Mm-hmm. In many ways, our sanity and teamwork were saved by the event. We will always be indebted to the Raiders for what they did for us. And then another one that I thought was great was Navy Commander Paul Galanti, also at Son Tay, 66 to 73, right? So it's 7 years in this place. He says, Son Tay Raid itself was the most memorable moment of my captivity. We knew Uncle Sam wouldn't forget about us. The Son Tay Raid proved that. And it's clear listening to or reading through these different accounts from POWs. Some of them had been in solitary confinement. There's one for 11 months in his own camp. After this happens, it spooks the North Vietnamese. They move them and consolidate them into rooms of 40 or 50 people. And so, Terry, you mentioned SRO, right? So for the non-vets out there, the senior ranking officer who is essentially in command, you establish a military hierarchy once you're in this scenario, right? So they have that hierarchy that's created. You are now in contact with others. You can share stories. They have classes in math and language, and it allows them to get through this horrible period in time. So yeah, to say it's a failure is crazy. Not a one of you Raiders is lost on the mission. You all come back, and it gives some peace of mind to these people who have been in propaganda zone for 4 years, basically, for some of them, right? Like, it's an amazing achievement.
Exactly.
I want to mention that you just mentioned Lee Ellis. Lee Ellis is going to be with us April 10th in a seminar, a symposium at Texas Tech University. It's a virtual symposium. Also, Leroy Stutz that I told, in telling the effects, what they formed there, all of these coming together at the Hanoi Hilton, basically, also the plantation, but they formed what was called the 4th Allied POW Wing. And a lot of people have heard of that and seen the shield or the patch for the 4th Allied POW Wing. That was formed only as a result of the Son Tay Raid. In other words, that was their moment at last when they had access to be able to take care of each other's wounds, to help people who were struggling psychologically. Of course, many were despondent. Many were, despondent because they had to divulge some information, under torture. You're going to eventually give something. You're going to break. And so now they were together and able to sort of minister to each other. You'd mentioned college classes, church services. They could have, celebrations of American holidays. It felt like they were finally with their brothers. They were with the Americans. Another book that came out just in 2019 was from another POW who had been at Son Tay POW Camp, and that's Carlisle Smitty Harris. And he talks about the radical transformation that happened. And this is only 2 days after the Son Tay Raid. So Navy Commander Mike McGrath is the historian for the NAM POWs, and he keeps in touch with all of them, keeps their stories for accuracy, and he even has the official lists of the memorized lists of all the POWs, and we list all the POWs in the book. And what we're trying to point out there is that all of them, these are the rooms they were in, the actual locations they were in, as of just a couple of days after the Son Tay Raid. And prior to that, they had been scattered among so many POW camps. So, it's wonderful when you hear from the POWs, even now, like April 10th or in 2019 with the book, of how rich that Son Tay Raid was, what it communicated to them. And then we also know that it communicated so much to the families of the POWs. It communicated so much to future POWs who, a classmate of mine, Rob Sweet, was a POW in Iraq for 19 days. And so, future POWs know that commitment that America will do whatever it takes. And there is no lack of volunteers to go on these missions to do what it takes to bring those POWs home.
One thing I want to add too about Lee. Lee has a couple of books out. One is Lead with Honor, and that's another good book to read if you're interested in this time of era of the history.
Yeah,
that's the POWs are just unbelievable people.
If I could ask Terry and Cliff, so first of all, we're wrapping up here soon. I just have a couple more questions, but one that I think comes to mind as I was reading through the book, if you could share, why was it there weren't any POWs there, right? Like, obviously, they just didn't, the intel wasn't there to tell them. They didn't want to spook the target set in advance, but what was it that made it that there weren't any POWs at the camp at that time?
The biggest comment that I've heard is the well went dry at the compound they were in. And, they needed water. And plus, there was also in a flood zone. If it did give a lot of rain coming, they could have flooded in that area. But the biggest comment I've heard, I don't know, Cliff, what you think, but the well had gone dry there and they didn't have the facility to do it. So
yeah, I can say that Smitty Harris, in his book from 2019, he explains that the well had run dry and that he believes that was the primary thing that caused them. It was July 14th when they removed all the POWs from there, and they took them about 15 miles south of there to a new camp that the POWs called Camp Faith. Lee Ellis believes that, yes, the fact that there was the well had run dry, as well as flooding, and then a third thing, that those combine to make it really just an ugly POW camp. And one thing from the middle of 1970, after the death of Ho Chi Minh, the regime was starting to think about how to use the media, and they knew that if it gets out that the squalor of Son Tay POW camp is what POWs are being kept in, so they wanted to try to eliminate that, and so this Camp Faith was a more recently built one. So Lee Ellis will point to those. There's one other thing. We've got interviews, and they're not in our book, but we sort of, with John Gargis especially, who's just a great historian, a planner on the raid, but also a great historian since. He has interviewed a lot of North Vietnamese commanders, and that final question, I think, comes. I think that's the strongest argument to say that all of them combined just make it, something where they knew they were going to have to close the Son Tay POW camp. It was just too ugly, too much of a PR problem with them repositioning that way. But the one thing that I want people to know, and this is a myth that's out there, it was not because they had any inkling or hint of the planning of a raid.
Yeah.
There's absolutely incontrovertible evidence that these testimonies from these North Vietnamese commanders, they had no hint. It was, as it was stated, alpha, alpha, alpha. That was the moment that they realized the Son Tay POW camp was being raided.
One thing we didn't talk about was the use of the Navy as well.
Oh, good point.
This was the largest nighttime battle the Navy did that night. And they were a decoy for us. And going back to the planners, the more I really realize what took place in this, the more respect I have for the planners.
Yeah.
They thought of everything. And the security, when General Manor and Bull Simons went around talking to all the admirals and everything, they had a letter from the Joint Chiefs of Staff saying, whatever these guys need, give it to them and no questions. And that is pretty heavy.
It is.
So
one thing to point out is that the PACCOM commander, Pacific Command, it was John McCain's father. So Admiral McCain was one who was told as early as July, and he was not, he was not sharing that with his staff, but he knew that when the time came, he was going to need to tell Admiral Bardshar, is the on-scene commander, to support this. And it was only about 2 weeks prior to the event that the Navy was brought in, and the ask was, can they make a huge diversionary raid? And I'll tell you, the Navy was superb. They were ready to do it on the spur of the moment. It took 3 aircraft carriers. It was the Hancock, the Ranger, and the Oriskany. Those 3 aircraft carriers gave 59 sorties, 59 aircraft that did this raid on Haiphong Harbor, and it totally succeeded in making the North Vietnamese look the absolute opposite direction away from Son Tay.
God, that's amazing. What a great, that's just incredible to hear. So, Terry, I want to get you guys out of here. I have a question for you in particular, and then I've got 2 more questions for both of you. So, Terry, talking to post 9/11 vets, who's the majority of who I speak to, but I've interviewed probably 3 or 4 Vietnam vets, but certainly for the post 9/11 vets, myself included. There's this feeling that in your 20s, because you're in the military as a veteran, like you've experienced a very rich purpose and mission-based environment that you might not have later on, right? And through the combat and the camaraderie, and Cliff, I know you know the same thing from being in the Air Force. Terry, for you, being 20 years old, going on this type of like seminal raid, the 56 other Green Berets, the legend of Bull Simons being on it, how hard was it coming down from that later? Like, were you able to find purpose later on in life after having this happen that early in your lifetime?
Well, if you had asked my wife, she said I found the second purpose. I know I've been blessed in being able to be a part of a raid like this with no experience in combat. I look back on it and I think they took a chance on me. I couldn't let them down. That was not my DNA to do that. And from this, I have had the good fortune of meeting a lot of wonderful people that I probably wouldn't have met had I not accomplished what I did at the raid. But the raid was, it was a God thing to me. I really truly believe that the good Lord was with us that night and took care of us, brought us home. And, when we landed back at Pope Air Force Base, we had already been debriefed. And my memorable moment was not the raid so much as after the raid. When I came back home and was getting off of the flight and turned around, I looked and I saw all these wives and children running out to meet their husband or father. And I thought, my God, these guys had daughters my age, kids my age or older, and they were willing to lay their life down for somebody they didn't know. And that has stuck with me. And I look at our military today, we have that same caliber. Yeah. And I mean, if you said I need a mission, you would have more men than you have a need for. Yep. And that's the DNA of an American to me, and what we're all about. And the military is, as you know, once you've been in the military, there's a camaraderie that you just can't explain to non-military people. And, and that sticks with me today. And my daughter has now experienced that. And it's a great feeling and that we have such a good military. And Right. I just can't say enough about it.
Yeah. Well, so that's great to hear. And I know there's a great photo of your daughter landing her final jump at Benning, right, at jump school. And I think it's you, is it Dan Turner, that are out there taking a photo of her?
No, Dan Turner took that.
All right, that's awesome. That just shows like how long that bond lasts.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't know we were there, and that was her night jump. Her fifth jump was a night jump with equipment, and she was the last stick, the last one off, and it was about 2:30 in the morning, and she come running up there, and Dan hollered "Hannah," and she looked and saw him. She knew who Dan was. And he snapped her picture and then hollered at me that I found her.
Yeah. And then, so to both of you, last two questions here. I'd like to ask everybody I interview these two things. One is, was there anything, so Terry, in your case on this raid, and then Cliff, in your career, was there anything you carried with you into combat that had sentimental good luck value, a talisman, or that just meant something to you that you wanted with you during that mission for you, Terry, and then Cliff as a pilot, or if you know for your dad how he would have answered this?
Well, for myself, we went in with no rank or anything. We were sterile, and you didn't take anything you didn't need, and I just took prayers. I had my praying for the guys and. That we came home back safely and hoping we'd have we had 2 extra choppers to bring back more. There were more more POWs than we expected, but unfortunately we didn't need them. And, but when you talk to the POWs and you realize what an impact it had on their life, you can't help but be satisfied knowing that what we did, even though we didn't rescue them physically, we rescued them mentally and give them the strength and the fortitude to move forward in the situation they were in.
Yeah, Ryan, I might say something kind of similar. I didn't have something material to carry with me, but knowing that I was doing something significant, I carried that with me in the cockpit and wherever we deployed to. And this is part of the answer to what you were saying to your post 9/11 veterans, as they leave the military, they're carrying that with them. There are life lessons that you learn. And in the corporate world, business, both Terry and me, people appreciate veterans. And what I mean to say is that they know there's something special that you've learned. There's life lessons, there's maturity, there's dealing with stress. And so, in our book, we try to get veterans to tell their stories. And one of the life lessons is, veterans, you have a mission. You have the ability to talk with other veterans. And as you know, as we all know, it's in the news, there's some veterans that really, really, really need to tell their stories, and they need to talk, and they need to have somebody that knows how to listen to their stories. Because, of course, it's like the pearls before swine. You don't want to share a story and then somebody says, "Oh, that's great," and they don't really know what to do with it. Veterans know what to do with it, know how to talk.
Yeah. Yep. It's true. And just the last question, I think I know the answer to this, but, Terry, for yourself on the raid, Cliff, your career, and then if you could channel what your dad would say, everything that you went through, the difficulty and the anxiety and uncertainty, would you do that all again?
Yes. Yes.
Cliff,
let me say that my dad has been willing to tell stories. He's pretty good at telling stories, and he's been willing to talk about the Son Tay Raid. But you see, there's something special when he gets together with other veterans, and they can talk and really tell the stories in a way that's appreciated. The Son Tay Raid, it was, I'm in Alabama right now. Our Alabama Senator, Jeremiah Denton, who was a POW, he was a Navy guy, he became an admiral and then a U.S. Senator. His summary of the Vietnam War, he said that the Son Tay Raid was the greatest thing that happened in the Vietnam War. And I think a lot of the Son Tay Raiders, Terry and my dad and those that were at the reunions and that we talked to so often, they know there was something really special that happened there. And it's something that we can be proud of. It's something that America needs to tell the story right. Of course, there's sadness about the Vietnam War, but this is a story that tells part of the heart of Americans. It's very, very special to all the Raiders.
It's kind of interesting since we released the book, how many non-military people have read it. And the comments, when I wrote the part of the book about myself and about what I did, it was things that, not to brag or anything, it's just what happened. And the life that I had as a kid, anybody can end up, it shows that you don't have to be a graduate of the military academies. No pun there, Mr. Cliff. But you can be, I was a high school graduate, hadn't even gone to college yet. And, I made the top half of my class possible. So.
And I was going to say, Terry, we don't even mention, you've run a successful business since then for many years. Both of you have these great stories to tell afterwards. It just says a lot about the character and what went into this. I'm so thankful that you wrote this book. You took the time. A lot of people who listen to my podcast are not necessarily veterans, and they just appreciate hearing these stories. So I can imagine you got the same response with the book.
Yep, did. It's amazing how many women have read it and liked it. That, because one of the things we took pride in doing is, military is full of acronyms, and, like SRO, senior officer, we talk that lingo, but what we did in the book, and I think we did a good job of this, is, if we use that lingo, we also explain what it was. So, and then the story would have pictures to follow. Instead of having all the pictures in the middle, we wanted the pictures to follow what we just discussed. And the publishing company, I think, really did a good job of working with us on that. So
that's great. And I will have links to your Facebook page, anything else so people can find you. I know you mentioned a symposium coming up in April. It sounds like people might be able to follow on that. Is there anything else that you just want to put on people's radar before we wrap up here, gentlemen?
Vietnam Magazine is going to be doing a nice article on it. And this next month, how many people have reviewed the book now? You got the Air Force Commandos, Special
about 80 that we're seeing. And also people can go to thesontayraid.com and get a lot of our stories and a lot of the spirit of the Son Tay Raid Association. And
that's perfect. Well, thank you so much for the time, both of you. Thanks for taking the time to write this book. I mean, it's a gift to so many people, and I highly recommend it. Just to hear the words of the people, the POWs in particular, just hit me hard. You can really appreciate what this was all about. And Terry, it's great just seeing your story unfold in the pages here. So thank you for doing that. And Cliff, thanks for telling your father's story there too.
Yep. Well, thank you. Appreciate it, and look forward to seeing the video.